Hey, Shabbat Shalom for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. Um, I think we are good, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we have been uh talking of recent about Elohim, right? And 2 weeks ago, we had a part two of the Elohim teaching from the time before. And I said, hey, look, I've never seen this before, but we're actually going to be doing a part two to a sermon. Um, then last week we spoke about Shavuot, and what was interesting about that is there was still an Elohim update to what we had already been learning. Well, finally, we arrive at today, and so this is after Shavuot. We're in the season of fatness now, and it's a very different kind of season. Um, and I find myself going, "Oh my gosh, there is a part three." Now, I don't know what that means. I just know that there's a continuation of this teaching, and it's almost been kind of an evolution in my life and experience. And it comes from a realm of humility, but it also comes from a realm of surrender. And what I mean by that is that there's kind of just a part of me that's like, okay, I've never been here before. I don't know what this means. I'm not quite sure how this is going to work out in the ministry itself, et cetera, et cetera. But I can tell you that there was a time where I was afraid. Hmm, that's not necessarily the word. I was refusing to teach the Imagination mini series, which is a part of the Renewing Your Mind series, because I didn't want to speak a message that I myself was not willing to live. You could call it procrastination, you could call it um, an unwillingness to change, whatever you want, but there was a time where it actually became apparent to me that I could not wait any longer. Um, I could not afford to, um, I could not afford to have uh, what's the word I'm thinking of? To have me neglect what I knew about imagination from you guys because of my willingness to stay in my junk, right? To stay in my mess. And so I realized I just had to let go, which meant I just had to change. I had to go with the flow, go with the action and movement towards if I teach this imagination series, I have to do something. I have to stop being afraid. And not only do I have to stop being afraid, but I also have to understand that everything's happening exactly the way it's supposed to, but that's actually a result of the will of mankind, which I'll explain in a little while. But in its simplicity, I had to understand that the Imagination series was directly linked to my fear or my hang up with just staying who I am in its simplicity. Okay. So there's a vulnerability to this message. Chain of events this morning just absolutely just confirmed everything that I understood about it. Okay. So I'll share with you the first one is that I said, hey, I texted a friend and I said, hey, you might want to watch this one because I think it's going to make or break After's Heart Ministries. And the reason is because once this is out there, um, we're going to change. Something's going to change in this ministry. I don't know what. I don't understand that part. But what I do know is that there was an absolute confirmation of this message in this way that accompanied this morning. So as I was driving down the hill from the house to come to the studio, there was this huge water truck that was one of those vacuum trucks that pulls water out, and is designed for like daylighting and all that, trying to expose pipes without actually digging them up so you don't break them, et cetera, et cetera. For those of you who know what a vac truck is, you understand this. But anyways, the point being is he's stretched across the road, right? And I'm like, okay, I'm going to sit here, wait for this guy. It looks like he might be turning around. And all of a sudden I was just like, you know what? Nope, I'm going to go a different way because there's more than one way off the hill. So as I'm driving back towards the house, going to go down the hill the other way, something tells me to go an alternate route, which is basically kind of a longer way. And I thought, okay, well, maybe it's because I just need some scenic experience before I get to the studio. So I'm driving. And as I'm driving, I go driving past this guy rolling this tire down the median, or not down the median, but down the sidewalk on the side of the road. And I drove past. I was like, yeah, I'm already late. It's almost 11 o'clock. I need to move it. Somebody will pick them up. And I just said, you know what? This is that thing, right? You are the change that this world needs. Everybody's driving by saying somebody else will pick him up. So I turned around, drove back up the hill, pull over next to him. I'm like, hey, can I give you a ride? He says, yeah, absolutely. You can give me a ride. I was like, okay, great. And so he gets in the car with me. We drive down to the gas station. He's like, man, I really appreciate it. I said, yeah, I'm not going anywhere. And he's like, well, I'm not going to argue with you. And he gets out, airs up his tire and puts it back in the back. And we drive back up to where he's at. And that made me about 15 minutes late. So why was the water truck in the road? Well, one could argue that guy needed a ride. Is that how the universe works? I don't know. But what I can tell you is that water truck made me turn around and take a different route, and I would have never passed that guy. And it was car after car after car passing him. And here's the thing. He was very successful at rolling the tire down the hill, right? But he had to roll it back up the hill, right? That's one. But then there's also the fact that looks like maybe his daughter or granddaughter or somebody and his father, because he said his father was with him, were all sitting on the side of the road in their car or outside their car because it was too hot, sitting on the side of the road, just, out in the weather or out in the sunlight and just sitting there. And I was like, yeah, man, I'm kind of glad I brought this guy. And there was maybe a little bit of an ego trip there. But when it was said and done, I drove away and I said, holy smokes, did that just confirm the message today? Well, that was a whole lot to tell you that I'm pretty sure that this is real. And I'm pretty sure that this is probably one of the heaviest things that I've ever understood about this stuff. It started with a question, and the question was in its simplicity, how is the power dummied down, right? Because we have this idea of limitation. How do we know? How do we know the limitation or the understanding is because we are, quote unquote, in the image of God. Remember, the image is actually a shadow, which means something blocked the light, right? And I'll illustrate that on the board in a minute. And of course, obviously, you guys see a fractal pattern behind me, and I know that some people understand what that is, some people don't, but this does definitely have to do with that. But I want to stress something very, very important that I think, somewhere along the lines we lost sight of. And I'm going to propose to you that it was partially a result of hypocrisy. It was a result of anti-Semitism. It was a result of bias, a result of a number of things, okay? Maybe fear, I don't know. But what I do know is that there's a moment in time in the evolution of the spirituality of the nation of Israel in which things went from a mythic point of view. What does mythic mean? It means a belief in something that you cannot see and that has a probability that it may or may not exist, right? a 50-50 chance it exists. I don't know if I want to go with that, but the premise is that it's hard to prove, right? And as we move through scripture, something interesting happens. And I'm going to propose to you that there's a reason behind it. If you start, and remember, I don't call the New Testament scripture. That's important for you to know. Yeshua is the one that used the word scripture, well, graphe, which is probably ketuvim, right? In the Hebrew, it's probably writings, right? The scripture, but that would include like Psalms, Proverbs, et cetera, et cetera. And very specifically, he says the scripture can't be broken. And so he's talking about the writings. He's talking about Psalms, Proverbs, Esther, Job, I think. I can't remember which ones are actually in the Ketuvim at this moment, which I apologize for that. But what I want to concentrate on is this thought process is as we move through scripture, okay? So as we move through the evolution, let's call it, of mankind, we go from these huge supernatural interventions for Israel to very physical, present interventions. What do I mean by that? I mean, like when they went into the promised land that he had promised to Abraham for his descendants, that the manna ceased, that the Jordan piled up, and it didn't happen again until Elijah crossed the Jordan. And it didn't happen again until Elisha crossed the Jordan. And then after that, done, right? We don't have Yeshua walking in the Jordan piling up. The premise is that we go from this supernatural interference with mankind to this area of process of time where there's no miracles. In fact, there are actually Jews, right, of the Sadducean sect who no longer believe in a world to come, no longer believe in the supernatural at all. They're totally and strictly logical. And they conclude their teachings and their doctrines and their dogma upon this idea of a logical perspective. Okay? Even though Yeshua comes along and starts working miracles, which evidently were not really prevalent. I mean, we go back to Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Elijah, and we still got some supernatural stuff going on, right? But by the time we arrive at this Roman Empire occupied Israel, we have these Jewish sects, and they are operating off of logic. To their chagrin, the rabbis even made a decision that was actually pretty detrimental to their process, and it was this. There was an argument going on about what made an oven clean or unclean, and I know that there are Christians who are going, who cares, but you don't understand clean and unclean the way that you should, even though that you were a Christian. But they're arguing about this, and finally this one rabbi says, well, if I am right, then let the wind answer. And so all of a sudden the wind blows, right? And they were like, we will not listen to the wind, right? And so then he says, okay, well then if I'm right, then let let the synagogue answer, and that synagogue's walls go woo. And they said, we will not listen to the synagogue, right? And then so finally, then he says, all right, well then let heaven answer. And there's this thunder and lightning and craziness going on, and they're like, we won't listen to that either, because Torah is here on earth for us to interpret. And it will be the majority of rabbis who make the decision about how to interpret it. Whoops. Because why? Because now all of a sudden we have ceased mythos altogether. We've ceased the myth altogether. Okay. Why is that important? Because I believe that we are in a day and age where we are going to begin to move back to the mythos and away from the logos. And it's not going to be a complete moving away from the logos, because if we do that, we turn into these really goofy, fanatical weirdos who believe in, spaceships and aliens and all this other weird stuff going on and forget the logic of reality, right? Okay. So there needs to be a balance. That's a given. But this is what I believe. I believe that when the Enlightenment came along, the science of enlightenment came along, that we were very, very, and I say we, I mean humans who question everything, as it were very, very disgruntled with the church at large, whether it be the Protestant church, whether it be the Catholic church. That's kind of irrelevant. We're not going to really mess with that. Who knows what the Eastern stuff was going on? Because why? Because it was a Western civilization that I am a result of, right? And so when I say we, let's just go with the ancestral concentration of humans that created the actual American Christian, because that's what we're dealing with today, is the American Christian. And unfortunately, the American Christian has things all jumbled up with their philosophy about revolution and liberty and their philosophy about revolution and liberty in Scripture. Okay. We threw off a tyrannical king, but we never were supposed to throw off the instruction of the intensification of all power in the universe. I'll get to that. Okay, so here is the premise. The premise is that when the Enlightenment came, science took over. The scientific method, which I believe was created by Kepler, maybe it was Galilei, I can't remember which one did that. But anyways, the scientific method was established, which says you have to be able to reproduce a test of a hypothesis. What's a hypothesis? An idea of how to apply a theory in material manifestation, let's call it. In other words, let's take a material and let's prove that this is true. Well, now, of course, when we get into psychology, then we get into psychometrics, and now we have what? Statistical analysis of people's answers to surveys in its simplicity, right? Whether it be personality typology or whether it be an abnormal psychology diagnosis, there's traits and there's ways in which to find out whether this is true, but it's a statistical probability. Okay, it's a standard deviation, which creates a z-score, which creates a mean, which says, oh, it's probable that this is what's going on. Okay, so in principle, when I'm talking about this, I'm not necessarily talking about psychology, but I'm talking about physical sciences, physics, right? I'm talking about quantum mechanics. I'm talking about Newtonian physics. I'm talking about Euclidean geometry. I am not going outside the box of those things into thought processes as much as I'm saying, here's the physical right in front of us. Why is that important? Well, for two very important elements of this message, which is A, we were told. Okay, let me say this. The man who actually accidentally messed up Christianity. What do I mean by that? Paul accidentally messed up Christianity. How? He made certain statements that Christianity latched onto without a lack of understanding. And now we have doctorates of theology coming along, men with doctorates of theology coming along, doctorates of divinity coming along and interpreting an English Bible and trying to establish doctrine off of letters that are responses to questions and also counsel from Paul to specific churches about specific issues of which we do not have. For example, what was the question in 1 Corinthians? What was he talking about in 1 Corinthians? And why is it Passover themed? And why does the 2 Corinthians letter seem to appear to be Shavuot or Pentecost themed? Where's the Tabernacles themed letter? Well, according to 2 Corinthians, I think it's in 6, where he says, read also the letter that I sent to Laodicea. And there's one other thing where it says this letter and the prior letter. In other words, he says, read the prior letter and the letter before that, which means there's probably 3 Corinthians. Okay, we're just going to leave it alone. But the point being is that people take this man who has created these things, not necessarily confusion, but created complex subjects and creating entire doctrine that completely does the opposite of what Yeshua said he came to do. Think not that I come to destroy the law, but that I have come to fulfill it, right? Anybody who teaches anybody to break even the least of one of these commandments shall be least in the kingdom of heaven. Well, that's scary. Okay. But the premise is then he also goes on to say, Paul goes on to say, hey guys, look, everything that you need to understand about God is present in what has been made. I made a point, maybe it was last week, or it's possible that it was during the Renewing Your Mind series, the Imagination mini-series part 1, where I made a point that what we do is we actually don't believe that we're going to receive what we want, and therefore we try to make it happen through coercion, manipulation, force, whatever. But then we also know and are content with the idea that it's a synthetic. When we talk about anything enriched, for example, what's happened? The natural's been destroyed and we've added a synthetic to make it be what it was before. Even the insulin in my pump for the diabetic symptoms that I have actually is a synthetic. How is it a synthetic? It's actually vitamin A. With the number 26 and number 27 DNA strands flipped, so that it looks like insulin when a cell encounters it. So there's like this little shape. I don't know what shape it is. And there's this thing that comes along and fits in that shape, right? That shape is the thing that unlocks the cell that allows glucose into the cell. Well, because they're able to make vitamin A look like that shape, it lets the glucose in. It's fake, right? It's synthetic. So we have all the synthesis around us, which is an acceptable alternative to having the possibility that you may not get what you want. I brought that up in one of those 2 series. I can't remember which one it was. But anyways, the point being is that we have this idea of synthesis around us. Paul says what has been made predates synthesis. Right? So we're not talking about when we create some synthetic material, plastics, whatever. Okay. I'm sure people will have their issues with the thought process of plastics or fake wood or any of these other things, right? But what I really want to get at is that the natural order processes that are present within creation itself, not manipulated elements, but creation itself, all speak. Okay. The fractal pattern not the fractal pattern, the sacred geometric pattern in a sunflower is actually the golden mean ratio. The length from one part of your limb to the other is the golden mean ratio. This behind me is the golden mean ratio, but it's also a fractal pattern. A snowflake is a fractal pattern. What is nature trying to tell us? The menstrual period is a cycle which demonstrates a what? Creating a space for something new, a special thing that is different from everything else. Everything, and I mean everything, that is naturally in existence and is following a natural order process is telling us a story. Which means anything that we experience in physics or otherwise, or any type of biological process that contains matter, is telling us about the intensification of all power in the universe, our relationship to it, and that existence of process in between. Okay? Now, what is important about this is something that Paul said in Romans chapter 8. And what we're going to do, we're going to go to the board and then we'll go to we'll go to the Blue Letter Bible, okay? And we will pull up Romans chapter 8, and we'll pull up this, I'm sorry, not Romans chapter 8, Romans chapter 1. No, it is actually Romans chapter 8. We'll pull up this statement and try to understand it a little better. So before I do, what I want you to understand is there's a purpose behind the process, okay? When we understand that, then things start to change significantly in our philosophy. And I'm going to share with you, you know, those times on my videos when I say, okay, look here, I'm going to make a statement. You can turn off your video right now, or you can turn off your YouTube right now because you don't need to listen to the rest of the message because I'm about to give you the answer. I give the freebie because there's some people who come here just to hear the answer. And then there's some people who come here to learn. And then there's some people who come here to learn to teach. And then there's some people who come here to learn to teach the teachers. Okay. But this is what I want you to understand. No matter what, I'm training my replacements. I am actually trying to make you understand how to learn, right? How to understand these things in such a way that you can actually come up with your own creative process of understanding. That's why we have the midrash afterwards. And for those of you who aren't in the midrash, you know, it's kind of one of those things where it's my internal congregation. And over time, obviously, the midrash will get bigger. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. I'm going to try to, since I don't have my tablet, I'm going to try to navigate to the Blue Letter Bible here on the whiteboard. So give me a moment to get that figured out. Okay, so here we are. And I guess what we're going to do, I think there's a quick navigation here that I can use. There it is. And we're just going to go to Romans chapter 8. And and I'm going to be in the King James for now, and there's a reason that I am. But what we are looking for is this word right here, manifestation. Okay. This verse right here, for the earnest expectation of the creature waiteth for the manifestation of the sons of God. Okay, let's change that to the Young's literal. It doesn't change much, right? Let me see, did it change? No, it did not change. Okay, so it doesn't change much, right? For the earnest looking out of the creation doth expect the revelation of the sons of God. Ooh-wee. Okay, so let's get back to here for a minute, and then we'll talk about this. So one thing that scientists and atheists and all of these people who have embraced the Enlightenment and have rejected the mythos, right, have in common is they don't know, they're beginning to discover that all creation has a very specific interest in humanity. And specifically, those humans who have decided to actually buy into the mythos a little bit differently than what has been going on. Okay, I know that sounded kind of confusing. What I'm trying to say is that for those humans who have decided to elevate, creation has been listening. They have been waiting. You know, when you create a chat program, what you have to do is you have to create what's called a listener, which is basically something that sits on a server and waits for a server request to come in, and then it will return. It will listen for a chat to come in, and it will return it to whatever destination the actual communication is going to. That listener is designed to just sit there and wait. And so there's literally been this sitting and waiting for humanity to get their crap together, right? That's the short version of this. Well, what's intriguing about that is the actual way in which creation has been waiting. I want to talk about a little bit impatient. For example, you get the person who, when you say, hey, we're going to go do something, and they get their stuff on and they go and they sit in the car. Well, you haven't even gotten ready to go yet, right? And now you're like, where are they at? Oh, they're already in the car, because why? They have decided it's time to go, and there's just that, for lack of better words, impatience there. Well, creation is impatient. It says it's groaning with birth pains, right? Groaning with birth pains. And so why is that so important? Well, in its simplicity, what we need to do is we need to understand the concept of sons of God, okay? Sons of God versus sons of Adam, okay? So, of course, you hear me using the G word even after I've taught that Elohim teaching and said, I don't want to use the G word, just like I don't want to use the word chaos, just like I don't want to stay in the Christianese that's been given to us via the Holy Roman Empire and its offshoots like Protestant Christianity. What do we know? We know that up until now, what we have thought we needed to do, and this was actually the church who initiated this, is we need to reject science in interest of the literal interpretation of Scripture. For example, the need and absolute insanity of a 7-day creation. The idea that it has to be in the box that you think it has to be because of what you read in an English Bible, which is a translation of a translation of a translation of a copy of a copy of a translation of an original language. That's right. Your Bible went through more changes than people do on the New York subway. Okay? When we are discussing this, it is important to understand that the whole idea here is that Paul says, guys, go look at nature if you want to understand your God. You want to understand the divine nature. You want to understand the eternal power. You want to understand the invisible attributes. I know that's not necessarily what it says, but you get my point. You want to understand the creation and the creator, you have to go look at the natural order processes. We have to look at fractal images. We have to look at the sacred geometry. We have to look at the golden mean. We have to look at the menstrual cycle. We have to look at the stars. We have to look at the process of how a star does what it does. We have to look at the spectral analysis. We have to look at the radioactive isotope decay, and let that be our guide to understand the intensification of all power in the universe. Paul said it. If it was so important for you to take Paul and modify the religion of the Israelites, then it is important for you to take Paul and go and actually look at what has been discovered. And the stubbornness and the lack of willingness to be open-minded about that is limiting you to be nothing more than a son of Adam, and I will propose to you a failed son of Adam, because you will not even buy into dominion. You won't buy into the idea that there is actually at the particle level an obedience to humanity. humanity's will and humanity's observation, which consequently is the leadox and the beholder, the man standing on the sea. And we'll get to that. That was a freebie. But I said that there was this moment on camera when I would say, hey, this is what it is, and you can turn it off. It's simple, okay? There is a relationship between the Son of God and the Son of Man and the relevance of those things and actually how creation itself works, including, but not limited to, attraction, reciprocation, and many other elements as a result of our mere thought, decision, and our very existence. I know that's a lot to be said, but you could turn off the camera right now and understand that there is a relationship between Elohim and Adam, and that those two together symbiotically operate something much grander and much more intense than we can understand. And everything in creation knows it but us. So let's see if I can go about proving that now, right? Okay. So let's start at the beginning. It says all creation is what? Waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. And of course, in the Young's literal, it says the revelation or the revealing or the illumination of the sons of God. Now, for you who are in Christianity and are in that rapture-induced stupor in which you think that there's going to be this moment when you're whisked away, or that you're going to die in honor of your religion as a result of people persecuting you, and so either A, you're going to be taken away because there's this great tribulation coming, and that there's some sort of activation of the book of Revelation, which consequently is probably one of the worst interpreted books by Christianity. I got news for you. This message isn't going to work for you. But if you're willing to open your mind for a moment and let things be different than what you thought you understood, it's very possible that you're going to gain an understanding that will remove your limiting beliefs and actually move you in a direction that is closer in your not only relationship to God, but in your process with creation. So the short version of this is going to be that revelation of the sons of God has to do with them all of a sudden being visible, or them all of a sudden being aware, okay? One of those two. The way that we're going to go about this is we're going to go all the way back to what is a son of God, a B'nai Elohim, and what is a son of man, a B'nai Adam, okay? So what we have to do first is we have to talk a little bit about clan, okay? What you need to understand is however much there is a actual legitimate linguistic evolution of Hebrew, those ancient pictographs tell a story beyond the possibility of man's understanding according to anthropology and archaeology of that time. For example, we have the drawing of, let's go here. Let's do this. I'm just gonna do my illustration. Of course, most of you know this illustration very well. Not many of you are unfamiliar with it, but I'm gonna kind of just really quick, jump in and illustrate this real quick. So you guys know this is what, like the sea, right? And there's these waves and water, and we have this guy, he's kind of standing on the edge of the sea looking out, right? And he's got his hands up, not necessarily in awe, in the sense of worship, the way that a modern day American Christian puts their hands up and waves them back and forth, thinking that that's some original ancient way of worshiping. But there is actually a premise that he's in shock or awe and therefore surrender. Like, I don't know what to do. I surrender. I give up, right? But either way, we know that in principle, he is at this moment, he is, let's see what color I'm going to use. I mean, yeah, yellow. He is beholding. And what is he beholding? He's beholding this. I know you guys are going to yell at me, but he's beholding this chaos. Why am I using the word chaos? Because when I say dysfunction or disorder, you don't think absolute disarray, right? Unless I use this word, your brain is not going to understand the level of not okayness is present in this sea, right? And of course, what behind this we have um behind this we have the sun going down behind the water, right? And so there is this kind of this premise of there being this, oh, those are horrible reflections, by the way. Of there's this premise of there being an extinguishing of the sun, as it were, or whatever. And there is this idea that that's kind of this power that the water has, as it were. Okay. But the reason why we need to accept that this water represents disorder, or let's say that this guy's opinion, okay, is that let's do it this way. Okay, that's spelled backwards. Compute, right? Does not compute. In other words, I don't know what's going on out here, but it's definitely not in my understanding. Therefore, it's the unknown. Therefore, it's fearful, to the extent that Israelites actually did not like to live by the sea. Now, I'm sure the Philistines had a kind of a hand in that because they lived by the sea. They were worshipers of fish, and they were definitely eaters of fish, and et cetera, et cetera. They were kind of attached to the sea. But the Israelites, they didn't like the idea of living near the sea. Okay. However, the point is that this right here, let me see how I want to highlight this. I'm just going to highlight this really quick in magenta. Okay. This right here is actually a drawing of this. Okay. I'm sure you guys have seen that symbol before. But let's just go with the idea that this eventually develops into the letter Q. Okay. And there's the modern modern evolution of that letter. In other words, this is the Kof. This is the Kof. Okay. And the Kof actually is a drawing of the sun on the horizon as it's setting, okay, or as it's rising. However, it most likely is more along the lines as it's setting. Why? Because a day begins in the evening, right? As the sun is setting, that's the end of a 24-hour period and the beginning of a new 24-hour period. It's not at midnight, which that one's really crazy because that has more to do with Egyptian theology than anything else. And it's definitely not at the beginning of the morning. Okay. Your day does not begin as the sun rises. Your day begins as the sun sets. Get over it. All right. So now the premise is, and you may say, oh, well, but that's cultural. Okay, fine. But the intensification of all power in the universe, for whatever reason, decided to use these people to communicate the insane wisdom of his thought processes in their language. And their language was originally actually a pictographic language. Now, many of the actual inhabitants of the earth at that time that this particular use of picture languages was used, there was a number of other civilizations that had a similar picture language, pictographs. Okay, not hieroglyphics per se, but instead actual pictures that told entire stories. Now, in this case, we have the Kof. Now, let's talk a minute about the Kof. Now, what we got to get into is the evolution of the Hebrew language as a process of cultural change or change in civilization based upon an actual evolution of technology. But here's the issue. As the pictographs start to develop into ideographs or into phonographic letters, like we have in the English language, where A actually represents a sound, not necessarily a picture of some sort. Consequently, the point being is that in the ancient pictographs, we may have a phonic sound assigned to it, but we have an entire story assigned to it. So even though that kof has the sound k, right? K, like a Q. It actually is a drawing of the sun at sunset, right? And it is the light gathering. When I talk about the evolution of language or the linguistics of Hebrew, the actual roots that are developed by combining the kof and another letter have to do with condensation, intensification, density, and gathering. For example, the Hebrew word for read, like to read a book, is kara, okay? Kara. And kara is actually a combination of a kof and a resh. And it literally means, remember, a resh is a drawing of a human head. So we have the kof and the resh come together, and what? They become the gathering of heads. Well, when was the gathering of heads? The gathering of heads was in the evening around the fire in the clan, right? The evening around the fire in the clan where they discussed what? The circumstances or the condition of the camp. This is where elders of their tents could come together, representation of each family or tribal group could come together and discuss with the clan leader, because remember, there wasn't a democracy. That was not a reality. Discuss with the clan leader the condition of the camp, and of course, he would make decisions about how to either remedy that or improve that, highlight that, etc., etc. Render honor where honor was due, etc., etc. Make decisions about people who had violated the will and or instruction of the clan leader, etc. Okay, so that's an example of the use of the kof. Another one would be kol, kof lamed, which is going to be the gathering to the staff, gathering to the shepherd staff, and kol means voice, because why? The sheep would gather to the shepherd's voice. Okay, so it doesn't mean sunlight at sunset. It doesn't mean light at all. But here's the crazy part. It means condense or an increase in density by a gathering together, a bringing together of parts into a greater sum or whole. What does the sun do? The sun draws elements into itself via gravitational pull, and very specifically the radioactive isotopes tritium and deuterium. They come together, and as they come together and fuse, a great intensity of energy is produced and sent outward. And at that moment, that density is so powerful that it creates a new gravitational pull that pulls even more tritium and deuterium in, which creates a greater fusion. This is why we have such an intense ball of fire in the sky. Now, That's which has been made. But now we have an ancient pictographic Hebraic illustration of that same process. You say, that's reaching. Is it really? Because they didn't use the word light, gathering at sunset. They used condense. And you gathered at the fire to keep warm, right? You gathered to the shepherd to be safe. It means to gather or draw together. How is that even possible in a Stone Age people? Unless the anthropologists and the archaeologists have it wrong, and they understood science the way we do. And perhaps maybe there was a thought process that it wasn't science, but that it was a relational interaction with the intensification of all power in the universe. Is that possible? I don't know. But what I can say is that a lot of the ancient pictographic letter pairs that create parent roots do not mean what they actually are as drawings, but instead mean something else as the linguistic evolution occurs. Now you can say, well, that's because technology increased and they were able to figure out that that's not actually how it was. Right. Remember, they are still in a process of relationship with the intensification of all power in the universe. You go back to the Sumerian Empire and Babylon, and we have Abraham smack dab in that time period. And during that time period, we have Abraham believing God and accounting him for righteousness enough that Paul, thousands of years later, says, here's the argument, right? Did he receive the blessing or the counting of righteousness before or after he was circumcised? Therefore, he's the father of all who believe. Anybody who believes in the intensification of all power in the universe and what Yeshua came to do, Abraham's the father of them, right? Okay. So the reason why this is important is because now you understand that the ancient pictographic Hebrew has a tendency to communicate things that would shock you. For example, the word light being what? The drawing of a human head and the drawing of an ox, and that somehow equating to light. When the truth is what it actually says is strong mind in the pictographic Hebrew. So just like we have the intensification of light at sunset on the west side of the sea, which is a philosophical process of chaos and disharmony and absolute unknown, we have many other connections and understandings. The reason why this is important is because when we get into the anthropological thought process here, we have the clan leader wearing horns on his head, wearing bull horns on his head as a crown to represent that he is the lead ox, right? That he is the El. He is the strengthened or lead shepherd. Sure, there's plenty of other shepherds. Everybody in the clan is a shepherd. In fact, they probably own sheep. But the difference between them and him is he is the shepherd of shepherds, right? Okay. So in principle, then, when we're looking at the word El, we need to understand that it's kind of like the end all of authority and therefore the end all of intention. Okay, that's going to be important. Now, what we get into is how the clan leader decides what instruction he's going to give to the people. He does it in the best interest, hopefully, right? Because I'm not going to sit here and say that this was a perfect world. I'm going to say that there were tyrants. I'm going to say that there were people who exploited the people who they were around. I'm going to say that there were absolute human imperfections present in this process. But the philosophical concept that the intensification of all power in the universe is an L does not diminish from the fact that the clan leader was an L. I'm going to go ahead and illustrate that on the board real quick. So obviously, when we are dealing with Hebrew, we are dealing with actually the Aramaic lettering system. And then the Aramaic lettering system, this is Aleph, and this is Lamed. But in the pictographic lettering system, that changes to something different. So now what we have is we have the drawing of a lead ox, right? Which consequently eventually became this symbol, which consequently eventually became this symbol, which consequently it became this symbol and eventually became this symbol. Aleph. The first letter of the Aleph Beit, or the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Why? Because Greek is derived from Hebrew pictographic letters. And so what does that mean? That means that our Aleph or our Alpha or our A is derived from the lead ox. Let's talk about the lead ox for a minute. I think that's going to be important. So the premise is that you have two ox. You have two oxen, I should say. So the first ox is actually the ox that is basically gotten to the point where it understands the plow line and what direction and straight line it's supposed to pull based upon the experience of having done it so many times. And then we have an inexperienced ox, which they yoke with the experienced ox. That way, there is a yoking that occurs in which now there is an ability for the stronger ox to pull the load. However, the stronger ox is wanting to try to pull away from the lead ox's direction, right? As he's going, he's going to try to pull, or he's going to try to back up. He's not going to listen to the driver. But the lead ox does listen to the driver and therefore creates a demonstration of example. And in that demonstration of example, the other ox will come into alignment and order with that lead ox. And so therefore, when we see the head of the ox, we understand it's the lead ox and not just any ox. Don't ask me how they arrived at that final idea that that's what that was in the pictograph, but that's what the experts tell us. Okay. All right. So now what is important is we know that this is the lead ox, which means what? There is an authority of wisdom present, right? But it doesn't necessarily equate to intention or will of a clan leader or will of the intensification of all power in the universe. However, once we add the Lamed, this is what we get. A shepherd's crook. Now, why is it upside down? Don't ask me that question. I don't know. But this is what I do know is that if you flip-flop it to this way, all of a sudden it becomes that. That's right. It's our L, Lamed, right? Which is a kind of a derivation of the R and the L, right? L and R kind of have this similar shaping in the throat with the tongue. But this is L, right? This is L. This is the intensification of all power in the universe that was worshipped anthropologically and archaeologically worshipped by the Semitic tribes. El. Okay. Now, you say, well, how do we get from El to Elohim? I will get you there. But what I'm trying to show you is that El is the derived parent root. I'm sorry, not the derived parent root. The word Elohim and Eloah and Allah is actually derived from this philosophical thought process of the clan leader who has the wisdom of the lead ox and the authority of the shepherd. And so this literally means strong authority. Okay. Strong authority. And so now what do we have? We have L, and you guys have seen this before, right? We have L representing strong authority or the highest authority. There's a scene in the old movie Dune where they're trying to get rid of the one of the generals of the House of Arrakis while they're there on the desert planet. And the way that they're going to punish him is they're going to strip him of his suit that basically made it so that he could breathe in the desert and be cooled in the desert and send him out into the desert. This is a perfect illustration of being put outside the camp, or a perfect illustration of outer darkness, or a perfect illustration of not being in the will or the intention of the intensification of all power in the universe, which is why we see such a illustration of that in not only the quote unquote New Testament, but we see it in Tanakh as well. We see the idea of being cast out as a result, not being outside the camp in the sense of protecting the community from communicable diseases because of the close-knit connection between all of them and the touching and the community meals, et cetera, that were present in the Israelite culture in the wilderness, but instead an understanding that you are no longer under the protection of the L of this clan. Okay? All right. Let's work on Elohim really quick. So now what we got to do, and I think the way that I'm going to do this, I'm going to do my whole shrinker thing here, right? We'll go ahead and shrink that down, and we'll just move it over here so that we can kind of work with this board a little bit more. And so at this point in time, I'm going to go back to this Aramaic lettering system, but the whole idea here is that this is the word Elohim. So let's talk a minute about this first. Where does that come from? Well, if we go back to here, we have what? We have the sea, or we have the sunlight at sunset. And so there was this idea of there being a work in the water or a work in chaos. And the premise is that there was some sort of action occurring. So in the ancient Hebrew, we have this letter here, which is called the Yod. Okay, the Yod. And the Yod is actually kind of a concept of this being like, okay, let's see if we can get here's a bicep, right? Here's the lower arm, here's the thumb, and here's all the fingers, right? And you're grabbing something, let's say there's a ball here, and so you're going to be doing a work, as it were, or you're going to do an action, and it means action. Okay, action or do or work. You're going to action something. And so the Yod says there's an action occurring upon the what? The water, right? The water. Which consequently, the drawing of the water eventually becomes the M in English, right? That's a horrible M. Let's try that again. There we go. See? The whole idea here was that that's a drawing of water. Okay, so in that context, then the Yod Mem become the word sea. So this is going to be the Hebrew word Yam. Actually, you know what? Let's stick with our yellow as illustrative. So this is going to be the Hebrew word Yam. not yam, yam, and it represents what? A work in chaos or a work upon the waters. Okay, a work upon the waters. And that word yam, when you add a yod, I'm sorry, when you add a vav, becomes the word yom, yom, which is what? Day. So this is C, right? And so why do we use the yod mem at the end of letters to indicate pluralness? Because it is the idea of the waters increasing. That's right. The waters increasing upon the earth. Well, where did that concept come from? Oh, I don't know. Maybe that big old huge wet thing that happened, around 5000 BC, where the world was completely immersed in a deluge. Okay. So, anyways, the point being is that this yod mem means to increase or intensify in the sense of water, covering the earth, as it were. Sure, why not? But then we also have the sun going down behind it, going down behind the sea, and therefore yom or day has the word sea in it. Oh yeah, that's right. It's all starting to make sense now for those of you who have been stuck in American Christianity all this time. It's like, oh wow, okay, this is starting to actually turn into a philosophy. Well, guess what? It's actually a language, a lifestyle, and a culture. So let's talk a minute about what we have going on here. The first thing is that we understand that the Hebrews in general, the Israelites in general, had a kind of an adverse or a dislike for the sea, right? And that partially was because, dude would go swimming, the undertow would grab him, and all of a sudden your buddy's gone. But it was also that the sun was going behind it, which seemed to appear that it was being extinguished, which I'm not saying that their philosophy was sound per se, but they're interpreting natural order processes to understand their God. And they wrote that language that way. Because now what they do is they say, our word for God, our word for the intensification of all power in the universe is actually Elohim. And what is going on there? Well, we know this is going to be plural in the sense of increasing. Why did I put an H there? Okay. Plural in the sense of increasing. So it's not necessarily one or two. In fact, I can show you something about that. So this is increasing. So there is actually a dual ending, which is ayim, which I won't get into. But the premise is that if I say ayim, that's two. But if I say im, that's more than two, which is a minimum of three, right? However, im is actually increasing. In other words, that it is not stopping at just three. So before you get an idea that Elohim has anything to do with trinity, then just understand it's actually increasing. The plural on the end of a Hebrew word does not mean many, but means increasing. Okay? All right. Now let's deal with this. Well, what do we know about this? Well, number one, obviously, we know that there's actually a dot here, which represents a what? O, which is actually a vav. So let's fix that. Let's go ahead and draw that in there. Elo. Ah. Elo ah. Elo ah. Okay. So what do we know about Eloah? In fact, let me go ahead and for the sake of just a closer understanding of this, let me go ahead and put in some vowel points. Those are probably not thick enough. I'll thicken them up a little bit. Eloah. Okay, Eloah. Now, here's the intrigue. First of all, there's a couple things that are really important, but the biggest one is that Eloah without the im on the end, or him, is actually an oath maker. Okay, so let's talk about this for a minute. In ancient understanding of humanity, in the ancient social understanding of humanity, if you can best me in combat, in battle, then I am now going to submit to you as an authority over me. But if you can't, then you will submit as an authority over me. In other words, whoever beats who becomes the authority, or the L. Now, once that authority is established, it is the responsibility of the L to protect the one who is under their authority, or their subordinate, as it were. We'll get into that a little bit later when we talk about greater and lesser. But the premise is that as we go through this idea or action, what we are encountering is an idea that an L is somebody who has bested somebody in battle, or who has demonstrated the ability to best somebody in battle. In other words, sometimes a clan will go, okay, they're big. Let's make a covenant with him. Who did that? Abimelech of Gerar, king of the Philistines, with Isaac, right? You're getting too big, so make a covenant with us that you will not destroy us, or take our land, or dig wells in our land, right? And remember that the Philistines were burying the wells, they were filling them back up with dirt. And so there was a kind of a covenant made, and they said, okay, look, this is where we're at with it, da da da. And some of that occurred with Abraham as well. Okay, so now what's important to understand is they saw Isaac as a threat. Who was Isaac? The L, right, of the clan. However, when he made the covenant with Abimelech, he was an Eloah, right? Let me illustrate for you. So in Hebrew, when you create, let's see, I'm going to use the word Rapha here. Let's see, let's go here. I'm going to use the word Rapha here. And so it's a chesh. Actually, I'm going to use Rofe. So it's a chesh pe vav he rochfe. Okay, and the principle is, oops, sorry, I did that backwards. Let me go get that. There we go. So this is going to be resh vav pe he. Okay, and that is the word. Uh-oh, got green going. Let's stick with our colors, because colors very important for learning. Very important for learning. Okay, so this is doctor in Hebrew, doctor, right? I think I spelled doctor wrong. There we go. Doctor in Hebrew. Rofe, right? Rofe. Rofe. But it comes from the root word. Oops. It comes from the root word Rapha, which means what? To heal. Now, here's the interesting thing about it. Rofe itself, and if I put the vowel points in here real quick, I can kind of illustrate that for you, just so that for those of you who are like in the primer or whatever, we'll kind of work with you a little bit here. So what we have is we have the let's see, let's do a different color, just so we can kind of illustrate these a little better. So we're going to have Rofe. Okay, Rofe. And this is going to be Rafa. Rafa. Okay, so this means to heal. But what people don't know is, even though this says doctor, this also is healing. ING. Okay. So if we were to actually put this in if we were to take the Resh, for example, let's make sure I still have that color good. Okay, Resh, Pei, Vav, Hey, which is Rafo or Rafua, then that is the actual infinitive, which means to heal. Okay. So now going back to our Eloah, you can see that this means to take an oath. Okay. So now you can understand, or now you could see the cultural element that comes into play in the thought process for Elohim in that sense. Now, I know I've covered that before, but there's a reason why I'm bringing you into this, because I'm trying to show you this premise of clan leader in the sense of intention or will, okay? Now, moving from that into the next part, we can actually bring it back to the parent root, right? So if we bring it back to the parent root, it's just this, right? It's L, which takes us back to, which takes us back to this, right? Okay, so now what we need to do is say, okay, so that's Elohim, right? That's Elohim. Elohim is a plural of an oath taker, which is actually who? The guy who's in charge of covenants if there is combat, right? Or if there is conflict. Abimelech of Gerar and Isaac of Abraham were what? Oath takers, right? They are the synthesis of covenant. They come in, they make a covenant with each other that they would not cross each other's land and that they would not interfere with each other's processes. Now, that's a land covenant, and that's important to understand that a marriage covenant is not a land covenant, and there's a very different process for a marriage covenant than a land covenant. So don't get it twisted when you have Christian leaders cutting their hands and squeezing blood into a cup and drinking it. Yes, that actually happened with Copeland and somebody else. That is a land covenant. That is not the covenant, the new or renewed covenant that you are a part of. Okay, so that was a side note. But here is the part that's important. You understand now that they have the authority to give instruction, the authority to make covenant, the authority over the clan in a sovereign sense. Nobody is higher than them. Therefore, they have what? They have the final say. Okay. Now, the reason why that is so important is because of what we're going to cover next. So we need to jump to a blank screen and we need to talk about who? Adam. Adam. Okay. So here's Adam. And actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and fix this. This is not supposed to be green. We've been doing our Hebrew in this color. Here we go. This is Adam. Okay. Adam. Well, what do we have in the word Adam? Well, the first thing that we have, interestingly enough, is what? We have let's see, I think we'll go ahead and stick with our colors here. We have the lead ox, right? And then we have what? We have the tent door, which I'll talk to you about in a minute. And then we have water. Okay, now, this is obviously in lexical form. However, it's a name, or so we think. I'm going to share something with you that's very important about Hebrew that you don't understand, or that you may understand, but maybe not grasp the level of, because you are an English speaker. In English, we have a separation between nouns and verbs. In Hebrew, verbs become nouns through the what? Through the participle or the infinitive. So a lot of words come out as nouns once they've been modified somehow. For example, the word malak, malak means to rule or to govern by walking amongst, right? What is the Hebrew word for king? Melek, okay, which would be a modification of the verb in order to create a noun. All right. So I'm not going to get into how that works because it actually comes out as an infinitive, but the premise is to rule is a king, okay? Or ruling is a king, okay? All right, so now what we need to do is discuss the premise that Adam is not a name, but is a verb, okay? Adam is not a name, but is a verb, and it is not a verb that is necessarily found per se in Torah. And because it's Adam, right? Adam, technically speaking, which of course the Hebrew speaker would pronounce Adam, right? And putting that that little bit of Middle Eastern tongue movement to the sounding. We need to go back to the pictographs to really get the concept. But what do we know? This is technically in lexical form, which means what? It's a root, right? It's either a child root, and I should call them stems. It's a child stem, or it is an adopted stem. Well, remember, you have an aleph, a yod, a vav, a hey, or a doubled last letter is a child stem or child root, and therefore what? We can drop the aleph. So let's do that really quick. Let's drop the aleph, and the way that I'm going to do that in simple illustration is I'm going to put this yellow box around it, saying that it is separate from this yellow box. Why is that so important? Because now we get back to the actual ancient pictographic parent root, which is dam. So this whole word together is Adam, right? And then we have this premise or this idea that dam now becomes what? A separate parent root. Therefore, we can draw the same principle here. We can get rid of that aleph, and we can just go straight to the parent root, which is what? The tent door. Well, let's talk a minute about the tent door. In fact, the way that we're going to do that is we're going to do our little shrinker trick again. Let's shrink that down. We'll move it over here. I know you guys wish you had digital tablets, huh, for you writing this stuff down. Okay, so now that we've shrunk that down, the next thing that we have is, let's see, let's use this. And we have this tent, right? We have the tent, and we have the tent door. Now, the premise is that this tent actually has 4 or 3 walls, depending. I mean, obviously, if you have a teepee, then we're really kind of getting into some complexities. But the premise is that basically the entire tent is walled from one end to the other. Every single side is a wall. However, the door actually moves, okay? Moves. Whereas this actually separates. Here we go with clan life again, right? So this premise is that there is a wall that moves and there's a wall that separates. The wall that moves can go, and of course we have to use our colors for this, right? So we're going to go with light green is our in, right? In, and our red, which I know you guys hate this color for illustration purposes, but we're going to go with our red for out. Why? You do not want to be outside the tent, right? Okay, so going in is a dynamic and coming out is a dynamic, moving or dynamic. Okay, now the idea of something moving back and forth is the premise here. And that can be carried over into many areas. For example, so remember that the drawing of the tent door, here, let's use this one. The drawing of the tent door looks like this. Well, if you were to take two of these and put it like this, then we have what are called danglers. Danglers, okay? Danglers. Okay, let's do that actually in a different color here. Danglers, which is what? Well, it's the chest of a woman, right? And it means passion. And this actually is what? David. That's David's name in Hebrew. Now, he has within his name actually a what? A vav. So now we'll move this over. And now we will go back to here and add our vav. This is David. And it means established passion or a consistent, passionate person or a lover, right? And David took the triangles of his pictographic name and overlaid them on a shield that represented his clan and represented his leadership. And when he overlaid them on there, it looked like this. Or better yet, looked like this. Now, why is that important? Well, first of all, it's a fractal pattern. We could get into that a little bit later. But the premise is that basically David's name, meaning passion, is two danglers. And so you understand that every single use of the dalet, which that's what this letter is. This is the dalet here. Actually, let me illustrate it this way. No, not like that. Here we go. This is the dalet in Hebrew. Okay, dalet. And so, and the reason why that's important is because now what we understand is that anything that has a D in it or a dalet in it has something to do with movement or dynamic. Well, what's our other letter? Our other letter is actually mem, right? Mem, which is what? The drawing of water. Here, let's do it this way. Mem, the drawing of water. Which is what? Moving water. Okay, here we go again. This is another example of there being a use of a pictographic parent root that is impossible for them to have understood. Why? Because systolic and dystolic pressure was not discovered until way, way later, maybe during the Greek Empire, I think. And yet they say blood is actually moving in their body back and forth. Literally, this is the Hebrew word for blood, dam. For example, akel dama, right? The field that was purchased by Jeremiah, that was the potter's field to bury strangers in, and that was the same field that was named after they buried Judas and purchased that field and buried him in it, which Jeremiah's process was a prophetic process of what would happen with Judas. Akeldama means field of blood, right? Field of blood. Dam is the word blood. So the root word of God is El, and the root word of Adam is Dam. Okay, so that means somehow there needs to be a relationship between those two. Well, short version, he says, don't drink the blood because why? The nefesh is in there. Well, when we talk about that, we need to go back to what it says in Genesis chapter 2, where it says, and God formed Adam from the dust of the ground and blew into his nostrils the what? The neshama, the breath of life, and he became what? A nefesh chai, a living soul. And then later on in Genesis chapter 9, there is an instruction given to Noah that you shall not eat the blood because the life is in the blood. No, the nefesh is in the blood. The soul is in the blood. Well, that would be a simple way to connect blood and Elohim because why? The soul is extant as a result of what? Of the breath of life, right? Or the neshama, the actual ruach of Elohim, the spirit of life present within him. How do we know? Because all flesh that had the spirit and breath of life in it died during the flood. That's what it says in the Hebrew. It says everything that had what? A neshama and a ruach had died in the flood. Okay, so now we understand that there is now a connection between Elohim and Adam, but there's more, okay? So there is first a part where we need to understand why this would be important. What is the difference between Elohim and Adam? It says that he made Adam a little lower than Elohim in the Hebrew in Psalm 8. Okay. I'll show you that, what happened with that, because I know you guys are like, wait a minute, doesn't it say you made him a little bit lower than the angels? Well, let's go take a look at that real quick. Okay, so going into Psalm 8, let's do that first. Psalm 8, we have Adam being made a little lower than the angels. So in the English, let's do the King James version here, because that's kind of what American Christianity knows. I know some people don't agree with that. But it says, "What is man that thou art mindful of him?" This verse right here. "And the Son of Man that thou visiteth him." Right? Okay, so now when we look in the Hebrew, we have something interesting going on. So let's go to Tools. We'll go to Interlinear. You can do this on any computer. And what we're looking at is what? Ma'anush. What is man, right? Or what? B'nai Adam, that you were mindful of him. We're not going to mess with Anosh right now, which is the singular of that is Ish. But we can definitely, at the very least, see that the Son of Man is in B'nai Adam. B'nai Adam, right here. Okay, B'nai Adam. Okay, but what I want you to see there is that it says Son of Man. Now, having said that, then we need to go to what? We need to go to the next verse and take a look at it. Thou hast made him a little lower than the angels. Why does it say angels here? Well, the reason it does is because in the Septuagint, they decided that instead of saying Elohim here, the Jews decided to interpret it as, let's see if it has the Septuagint in the bottom here. It doesn't the way, oh, there it is. Yes. Okay. In the Septuagint, they used angelos instead of Elohim. made him a little lower than the angels? No, in the Hebrew, it actually says right here, ma'at, a little bit lower. There's a mem on here, but that's Elohim, Elohim, which is what? From Elohim, made him right here, set him or placed him a little bit lower than Elohim. So Adam is placed lower than Elohim. Okay, there's an intrigue here because why? Because in another verse, we're going to see that they're actually instructed or told that they are Elohim. We're not going to get to that yet. But the premise is now what do we have? Now what we have is we have a concept here that there is a greater and lesser. So there's an Elohim and there's an Adam, or I should say B'nai Adam, sons of Adam. Now, it says you have made them, thou hast made them a little bit lower. And the premise is that has made them a little bit lesser than Elohim. Adam, sons of Adam have been made lesser than Elohim. Okay, that's a crazy thing because haven't I been teaching that we are Elohim? Okay, we'll get to that. So the premise is now that what we need to do is we need to look at what is the difference between a son of Adam and a son of God. Because remember, our verse in Romans 8 says that all creation's waiting for the manifestation of the sons of God. Well, there's a few theories out there. One of those theories says that there is actually a group of gods who are under a clan leader god, as it were, and those group of gods are actually council or advisors to the clan leader who still makes the decisions, but these gods actually have the option, or these Elohim have the option of doing their own will or their own version of process. And of course, that's where we get in trouble, because eventually the sons of God came down and was with the daughters of men. And of course, that created the Nephilim. And there was this whole thing in the book of Enoch and this whole thing in the book of Giants about meddling with DNA and all this other stuff. And it was actually these sons of God, or these Elohim, that were present in the divine council. That's not the only theory out there, and I would propose to you that you keep an open mind on both ideas. But the premise is that in general, we need to go back to that understanding, that logical, simple understanding of the intensification of all power in the universe and what an Elohim actually is. Forget whether there's a divine council or not. Let's go back to the first principle, right? The primordial intelligence, or the beginning of everything, which was what? Where the intensification of all power in the universe dialed itself back, contracted, created a limitation, which was a free will, and that free will instantaneously said no. And then evolved to not without my permission, in which then there was a divine spark planted within that void, and that void then became an intensification of power, but could not attain to the intensification of all power in the universe. So it's an intensification of power dialed back. We go with this kind of this illustrative process of 1% darkness and 99% light, and that darkness can never, ever, ever attain to the light, because if it did, then that would just cease to exist, and we'd go back to just having the intensification of all power in the universe. If you want to know more about that, go back 2 weeks ago and watch that video, because that video kind of covers the contraction in which we have outer darkness, that last little bit of darkness that can never, ever, ever attain to the light. All the lower worlds, all the lower contractions, all of the fractals themselves can attain to a higher light. It's just they can never attain to that last bit of light, or it all becomes one flame. You've seen me before take the candles and put them together to illustrate this, to show that Elohim, when it comes together into an absolute function of existence, is one flame, right? Okay. Now, the reason why this is so important is because now when we start to get into the next part of this, you will begin to understand the purpose behind there being sons of Adam, just like when Yahweh says to Ezekiel, son of man, no, not son of man, son of Adam, can these dry bones live? Right? He asks the son of Adam, not a son of God. Now you say, well, wait a minute. This dude saw some heavy duty stuff for just being a son of Adam. Why? Because in Romans chapter 8, it says that those who do the will of God, are obedient to the Torah of God, right? Those who walk according to the Spirit, not according to the flesh. Remember, I said in verse 3, for what the law could not do, in that it was weak in the flesh, God did by sending his own son on the account of sin, for that the righteous requirements of the law might be fulfilled in us who do not walk according to the flesh, but according to the Spirit. And then in verse 11, not 11, I think in verse 8, it says, for the flesh is not subject to the law of God, nor indeed can it be, right? It is an enmity with God, or an enemy of God. And so in that premise, we understand that we are not that because we're in Christ. In fact, and I think it's in verse 10, it says, we are not of the flesh because we are in Christ, right? Okay, so the premise is that if you are a son of God, you are in Christ. Well, what does that do for Ezekiel? Well, Ezekiel predicted Yeshua, and therefore he has absolute understanding. He's a New Testament saint. He saw Yeshua's day and rejoiced, just like Abraham did. They all had these revelations about this Messiah that was going to come, and he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. How is it counted to Abraham for righteousness when he believes God? Because of what Yeshua did. You say, how is that possible? Well, he was the lamb slain from the foundations of the earth. That's exactly what John says. Behold the lamb who will take away the sins of the world. And what does it say in Revelation? The lamb that was slain from the foundations of the earth. Therefore, what? We have a retroactive. He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. Therefore, Noah, Abraham, Adam, Abel, everyone had an opportunity to be a part of the renewed covenant. Now, I know that sounds off the wall, but look at David. David says, what? Create in me a clean heart, O God, right? Don't take your Holy Spirit from me. Restore to me the joy of my salvation. What salvation? When did he have a joy of salvation? Well, I would say about the time that he had the vision about Psalm 22. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? They pierced my hands and feet. They divided my garments. They gambled for my special garment. It's all there. It's all there. Those never happened to David. David never had his hands and feet pierced. Come on. And that was not an idiom. That was a prophecy of what was going to happen to the Messiah, who was an absolute replica of the original Adam and had an opportunity to do what Adam chose not to do, and that was to stay in the garden and not eat the fruit. All the way to death. And even in Hebrews, it says, we have yet to resist sin to the shedding of blood. In other words, we will not resist sin. What is that? To the shedding of blood? Is that premise that we would resist it totally, even if we were under threat, right? Okay. So let's get to the next part of this message. Obviously, what we need to keep in mind here is the premise that there is an instance of understanding that we are both sons of Adam and sons of God. Okay? What you need to know is that Adam and his sons were given dominion over creation. Okay? Dominion over the flyers that fly, over the swimmers that swim, over the crawlers that crawl, over Aretz, over the earth. The son of Adam has rulership or sovereign intention over earth. Okay? Now, if we were to take and hop in the space shuttle, fly out into space, and I apologize to those of you who are flat earthers. I know this would probably drive you crazy, but we're going to fly out into space. We're going to get out there, and when we get out there, we're going to take the Hubble Space Telescope. We're going to take and point it off in some direction to the edge of the known universe. We're going to mark one of those spots on our coordinates. We're going to load the telescope into the space shuttle, and we're going to shoot off in that direction, go to sleep in some ice or whatever it is we do. We get to there finally, who knows how many years later. We get there, we open everything back up, point the telescope, and there again we point it, and again we see the edge of the known universe. We pack up, fly down there, and this happens over and over and over and over and over again, and we never arrive at the edge of the known universe. Because why? Because this realm itself has an infinite element to it. That infinite element is going to become very, very, very important here in a moment. But the premise is that there is some sort of place where infinity has an end, right? And there's some sort of place where negative infinity has an end. We'll get to that. But in that process, it is very important to understand how Adam, or the sons of Adam, have their dominion over the earth. It was a jurisdictional gift or inheritance from whom? From the intensification of all power in the universe. When he says, let us make man in our image, right? Okay. But then in chapter 5, it says, Adam begot sons and daughters and he says, behold, I have begotten a son in my own image and what? Likeness? No, in my blood. Dam, right? Dam. That's what it says in the Hebrew. And so that's important because now we understand that the sons of Adam are different from the sons of God. However, in Luke chapter 2, at the end of the chapter, it says Adam was a son of God. Okay? So we know Adam was both, but his sons are sons of Adam, and they rule over the Aretz, over the earth. Sons of God have dominion over the heavens. Not ready for that one yet, but that's what Malchut Hashamayim is. That's what the kingdom of heaven is. It's the rulership over heaven, okay? Which is where? Within you. Okay, we'll get to that. So now, what do we need to do? We need to reconcile the Adam and we need to reconcile the Elohim, and we need to understand how that works. Because why? Because in the contraction, we actually have a presence of Adam and the presence of an Elohim. How do we know? Because he says, let us make. That's the world of Asiya, or the world of divine will, that begins to create an actional process that will eventually become the material world. In other words, the Yetzirah, the world of formation, is not the world of Asiya. He says, let us make us. Let us saw Adam in our image. In other words, when he formed Adam out of the dust of the ground, that was not in his image. In other words, there isn't some big old God walking around on the clouds up there with a nose and eyes and kind of looking like he has a burly chest like mine. Okay, I'm kidding. But the premise is that there is instead proof of a blockage. There's proof that something blocked the light. We are that proof, but not in this realm, which means Hashamayim is a different realm. But Hashamayim is what? In the plural, which means what? There's more than one heaven. So when we talk about the Malchut Hashamayim, or the kingdom of heaven, we have something going on that we don't completely understand. but there's more than one heaven. Even Paul says he was caught up to a different heaven. In the Kabbalah, but also in the Talmud itself, there is a mention of 7 heavens, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's all the heavens. That's just the heavens that are in the known universe, as it were, or maybe that's not the best way to put it. In the known infinite understanding. Okay. 7 heavens. And of course, people are like, oh, 7 heavens, and that's where God dwells. And okay, which God, right? Are we talking about the Elohim that is at an exact intensification of all power in the universe? Or are we talking about a contraction? Because every single contraction is an Elohim, including us, which are a final contraction. And what you need to understand about that final contraction is that there cannot be any more contractions. We can't contract, okay? Because after our realm is 100% darkness, which is a whole nother discussion. Okay, so now what we really need to understand is, how does this dumbing down occur? Well, remember what I said earlier about Paul, that he said, look, guys, all you got to do is look at creation. Well, here's the thing. If we look at creation and understand the natural order processes, where do we understand those? Well, when Benjamin Franklin put a key on the end of a kite and put the kite out into the thunderstorm and got zinged by the static electricity of the thunderstorm, in the process of there being a colliding of fronts, of a cold front and a warm front, and that creating a storm, and that storm creating lightning, and that lightning needing what? Ground. That's one thing that's important. It needs aretz. It needs earth. Okay. But then also it has a charge that's built up that has to go in some direction. And that, when it goes into some direction, follows the path of least resistance, just like water. It flows just like water. So we can look at water and see our same principle. But then also we understand that that's the moment when man discovered electricity. Or did he? Because we find what? Batteries in Egypt. Maybe we shouldn't be so arrogant to say that we've discovered things, but maybe we actually remembered them. I don't know, but I will say that that's probably true. Because what we did is we either A, rejected the church and went after absolute science to the point where we have this asinine idea that there is some sort of connection between species and that somehow occurred as an evolution, instead of understanding that species evolve within themselves. But then also because we have to accept that the scripture says that after its kind was created. Okay. But the premise is then also we have to accept that there is also a definite elevation of our species spiritually, or a de-elevation or descension of species when it comes to things that are spiritual versus things that are material versus things that are philosophical. But I propose to you that here's that camera moment. You could turn it off right now. I propose to you that the philosophy, the matter, and the spiritual are all one thing. Okay? Keep going with this. All right. So the premise is we discover electricity. Well, what do we got? We can't use lightning to light a light bulb, right? I mean, if a person gets hit with lightning, they have some very serious things happen to them, right? We got the guys who work on the high tension, high voltage power lines that are around 750,000 volts, and they accidentally do the wrong thing and just explode into hamburger everywhere, right? There's a ceasing of material existence in that moment. So it's a very, very, very intense process going on up in these high tension, high voltage power lines, which consequently are created as a result of a generator, which is kind of a object that has either some sort of coal power going on, some sort of wind power going on, some sort of water power going on, some sort of effort to move the generator and create electromagnetic field. Now, The reason why this is relevant is because we can look at the principles of electricity to better understand the relationship between Adam and Elohim and how he is both. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back to our board here and let's talk a minute about this. So the premise is that if you take a magnet, okay, I'm just going to draw a magnet here, and you create, and it has a magnetic field. So let's talk a minute about this magnetic field. The premise is that there is a field around the magnet, okay, that looks somewhat like this here, okay? And if you take a magnet and you wrap, and you bring in, let's see, let's bring in some electricity with this pin, and you bring in some electricity and you wrap the coils around it, okay, like that. So you're bringing in, let's say, 750,000 volts. And then you have on the other side another wire wrapped around it, okay? What will happen is the change in the electricity will increase or decrease the magnetic field, and that will result in less electrons transferring to this wire, which means what? We're dumbing it down to, say, 220 volts of electricity. Let's do volts. This is what you call a transformer. So the premise is as power comes in here, okay, it has a intensity to it. Now this is important, all the information present in the electricity does not change, okay? And it's going back and forth just like blood. This is important. It's going back and forth just like blood. So literally it's going this way and then it's going this way, and that's changing the push and pull of the magnetic field. Now, the premise is that push and pull of the magnetic field is now transferring electrons through the magnetic field to the other wires. Now, I may have a little bit of a hang up, or not a hang up, but I may have this a little bit inaccurate, but the premise is that this is how a transformer works, okay? And so think of this as a contraction. So what's happening is power's coming in here, okay? And in fact, I'm going to illustrate that power in a different color. I'm going to illustrate that power because of who and what it is. I'm going to illustrate it in this color. So power's coming in here. And as it's coming in there, there's no connection to these wires, right? There's no connection to the wires on the 220 volt side. Those wires are actually separate. The only thing that connects the two is magnetism, and I'm going to explain that in a minute. And so the premise is that as that comes through, then it exits the other side as a different voltage, okay? It exits the other side as a separate voltage, okay? And so the premise is that something actually creates the dummying down. Now, going back to the understanding that the world of Asiya, or the world of Asa, let us make man in our image, is important because why? Because at the world of Asiya, we are talking about intention, okay? And what I mean by that is that there's no there's no matter present in the world of Asiya. Height, width, depth, time, matter, E equals mc squared is for the world of formation. It's this world where, and God formed Adam out of the dust of the ground, breathed breath of life into his nostrils, and he became a living soul. But the Adam that we're talking about in Genesis 1:26 is a very different Adam, right? He's an action in the world of Asiya, or an intention. Meaning what? In principle, Adam is actually the proof that the light was blocked. The light being blocked is a dummying down. So what does that mean? That means that this right here is Adam. That is Adam as an Elohim. Remember what an Elohim is. It's all of the intensification of all power in the universe, all the information, intelligence, understanding, all of that transferred or descended down into a lesser power. Okay. I know that probably drives some of you fundamentalists crazy, that you could think that he actually is a reduced part of himself. Okay. But you need to accept that if he's not, nothing can exist in that power. It's too powerful. Now, the reason why this is so relevant and important is because now when we talk about magnetism and we talk about electricity and we talk about electromagnetic fields, we need to understand something really, really important. And this is going to be one of the climactic elements to this message. In its simplicity, let's see, let's color some pins here. So I think I want my finger to be that color. Let's do this one. Let's do attraction in magenta, and then we will do the actual movement of electricity in green. Okay. All right, so let's go over here. So here we go. So first thing you need to know is that something that is positively and negatively charged. So let's just draw this. Let's draw this illustration real quick. So we have this thing and we have a plus sign here and we have a negative sign here. And so the premise is that there is an ability for something to flow in a certain direction. Does that sound familiar? Yes, it does. That comes from last week's teaching about the Ruach, that it is a prescribed path or a flowing, and that when we surrender to it or we allow ourselves to flow with it, that we are actually in our purpose, and then that purpose will be enabled with abundance, intelligence, knowledge, and whoever needs that for that purpose to exist. And so in that sense, then, what we can accept is that if there is a let's say that there is a positive charge here. Let's do that differently. So what I want to do here, I'm going to go ahead and illustrate this first. So what we have is we have an electrical charge, right? The electrical charge is coming down the line and it's traveling from what? From positive to negative. Okay, that's the premise. It's traveling from positive and negative, and so we'll just create some positive and negative here. Here's the positive. Wait. So here is the positive, and we will create a negative in a different color. Let's just go with that color right there. Here is the negative. Okay, so now this is a charge, right? Something is charged. Remember, guys, this is important. Remember, energy is neutral until it enters our brain. When it enters our brain, we polarize it. We make it negative or positive and move it in that direction. Okay, that's the premise behind the malevolence and benevolence of a human being. But energy itself is not interested in being polarized. It's not, for lack of better words, good or evil. Okay, so now we get back to this premise here. And so the whole idea is that if something is traveling down this way, Let's not do it that way. So if something is traveling down this way, it is actually, this is electricity. So we'll go ahead and label it electricity. So this is that idea of volts, right? This is that 750,000 volts. But here's the intrigue, is that creates an actual magnetic field, or what we call an electromagnetic field. Okay. Now that electromagnetic field is basically an attractor, as it were. So as we're moving from negative to positive, right, or from positive to negative, depending on the charge, we are creating an electromagnetic field. Well, interestingly enough, that electromagnetic field turns in a certain direction based upon which way it's going on the charge. If it's going to a negative charge, then obviously the electromagnetic field is turning a certain direction. And if it's going to a positive charge, it's going the opposite direction. So if we have two circuits and we have another line of electricity going, something very interesting happens, and that is that there is a concept or an idea that if we were to send this in this direction, that there would be a very different electromagnetic field. Because why? Because basically this would be going this direction. Okay. Now, what you need to know is that is resulting in, and this is important, that is resulting in a force pushing away. Okay. Now, remember what Paul said. He said that which has been made. Well, where do we get electricity from? We got it from lightning. So the truth is that if something is flowing from a positive charge to a negative charge, or from a negative charge to a positive charge, there's actually an electromagnetic field. That electromagnetic field attracts or repels based upon if it's going the opposite direction or going parallel. Now, watch this. Now we have two going the same direction. And so what happens? Now, all of a sudden, there is a premise that by going the same direction, there is a concept here that they actually, by going the same direction, are going to create a very different result, which is what? That they would actually attract. So now when you see the verse that says, draw near to God and he will draw near to you in James, there is a sentiment and an understanding that there needed to be what? A parallel connection or process. Well, let's talk about this for a minute. Let's get back to the original Hebraic understanding of Satan and of the path and of Elohim and all of those things, right? So what is the Ruach? The Ruach is a prescribed path, an actual path that you hike down going from one destination to another, right? That was the premise. What is Hasatan? It's the thorn that turns continually. In other words, it's the thorn that causes you to turn off the path continually. So what is that? That's some sort of suggestion for somebody who is suggestible to deviate from the path somehow, right? So what does James say? James says, I'm going to read it to you, in fact. Let's go ahead and pull it up. I think it's important enough that we're going to go ahead and we are actually going to pull it up on the screen. Okay. So we'll go into this here. We're going to go into James chapter 4. Now, before we go into chapter 4, I'm just going to read something to you really quick because I need to illustrate something for you, okay? Verse 1, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes which are scattered abroad, greeting. To whom? The 12 tribes. So my question to you is, if you're reading that book, if you're reading the book of James, what tribe are you? Because James, who at that time was very aware of the diaspora, was very aware of the lost tribes of Israel, did not write it to the Gentiles. So he was either anti-Gentile or you are one of the 12 tribes. We won't get into that much further except to say that you have to be Israel or Judah to read this letter and apply it to yourself, which would be very important when we get into verse 4. So let's go over, to chapter 4. So let's go over to chapter 4. Okay. And in chapter 4, this is what it says. It says, from whence comes wars and fightings among you? Come they not hence of your lusts that war in your members? Ye lust and have not. Ye kill and desire to have and cannot obtain. Ye fight and war, yet cannot, because ye ask not. Ye ask and receive not, because you ask amiss. What is that amiss? Because you don't believe you're going to receive what you ask for, that ye may consume it upon your lusts. Okay, but also the premise that you obviously are asking for the wrong reasons. But then, you adulteresses and adulterers, know ye not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Whomsoever therefore will be a friend of the world is an enemy of God. Okay, remember that word enemy is hasatan, okay, Satan. Do ye think that the scripture saith in vain that the spirit dwelleth in us, lusteth to envy? But now in verse 6, but he giveth more grace, wherefore he saith, God resisteth the proud, but giveth grace unto the humble. Then what does verse 7 say? Verse 7 says, submit yourselves therefore to God. Resist who? The devil. What is that? That is that thorn that causes you to turn off the path continually, and he will flee from you. Who will flee from you? The devil. Who's that? The adversary. Draw nigh to God and he will draw nigh to you. Oh, wow. How do we draw nigh to God? Well, according to that which has been made, just jump over here for a minute. According to that which has been made, you have to have the same charge. According to that which has been made, electricity that travels from one direction to another based upon its path of least resistance and grounding, there is a process of this going on. And as this is going on, there's a drawing near. But when this is going on, there is a pushing away. That happens to be contrary to the charge, right? So when there's a parallel charge, there's a movement of electricity from one place to another through the process of a ground, there is a premise or an idea that there is actually what? There is actually a movement of that electricity in the same direction, creating an electromagnetic field that draws or attracts. Okay? Now, in that sentiment, it is very important for you to understand the three-dimensional process of contraction. I draw circles on the board, but the truth is that the contraction was actually fractal. Let me demonstrate for you. So when we're working with fractals, the importance of the fractals is simple. So let's say that I draw a triangle, okay? And in that triangle, I take the center of the longest leg and I draw a line to the point opposite or the angle opposite. Now I've created yet another triangle. Within that triangle, if I take the center of that longest line and I draw it to a point, then I create yet another triangle. If I take the center of that line and draw it to a point, then I create yet another triangle, and yet another triangle, and yet another triangle, and yet another triangle, and yet another triangle. I can't go much further because it's going to become what we call infinitesimally small. This is a fractal pattern. And this is what we see in nature in things like the sunflower. And this is also happens to be, it also happens to follow a pattern of 1 plus 1 equals 2, 2 plus 1, 2 plus 1 equals 3, 3 plus 2 equals 5, 5 plus 3 equals 8. What is this? This is the Fibonacci. I'm not even going to try to spell it. This is the Fibonacci sequence, which happens to also be what? The golden ratio, which is what our drawing is of our conch shells, right? And the pattern on the sunflower. So here's the intrigue here. As we get infinitesimally smaller, there are more parts. So we start with this big old huge oneness. And then we work outwards into many, many, many parts three-dimensionally. Picture a sphere contracting, and as it's contracting, it doesn't only contract into a smaller sphere, but it contracts into more than one smaller sphere. And again, and again, and again, and again, and again, until it gets down to us, where right now we're at what? 8 billion people on this planet. And so the premise is that we are Elohim that have been what? That have been dialed back from the intensification of all power in the universe. What's an Elohim? An Elohim is something that contains all the information, all of the intelligence, all of the power dialed back for existence and for purpose. Dialed back for purpose. And then once that arrives at us, there is no longer an ability to go any lower, because that would be 100% darkness, and there is no such thing as that contraction, because there can't be any light there, because there's already 1% light here. So it's 99% darkness and 1% light. We are that light. Where do we learn that? When Yeshua says, "You're the light of the world." He's using that word "or," which happens to also be what? The ox's head, the lead ox, and the resh, right? Which is what? Strong mind, which is something that is not suggestible. The suggestibility of a mind has to either come through trust, manipulation, coercion, or force. Okay? So trust or manipulation or coercion or force is what reduces the strength of a mind. In other words, trust does allow for what? The vulnerability of a reduced strength of the mind. You have to trust, right? If you're going to trust somebody else, you're going to trust that they are going to think correctly and stay within the confines of what their purpose or existence is. Now, obviously, when we get into wounds, limiting beliefs, and entitlements, we run into a problem. So now what you understand is when we're dealing with fractal patterns, there's a starting point, and it works backwards into a smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller point. Well, that also means that there's an ability for ascension, okay? So this is what I want you to think about. However much Adam deviates from the charge that God is moving in, then Adam moves away from Elohim, and they become more and more separate, right? They're moving out, moving out, moving out, moving out. Because why? Adam's going this way, God is going this way. Proof is in the electricity that there's an attraction that draws near to God through the parallel charge. So now what we need to ask ourselves is, what are the charges? Well, it's in its simplicity. If we were just to reduce it down to a process, we've got malevolence and benevolence. We know malevolence is the result of an Elohim being reactive to the darkness. And that benevolence is a direct emanation from the intensification of all power in the universe. In other words, the darkness itself is what creates the malevolence that the Elohim would move towards. Why is that so important? Because now we understand how the opposites are moving away from each other, right? There's this idea of it moving away, as opposed to drawing near, and you are supposed to humble yourself. What does that mean? That means that you let go of your wounds, your limiting beliefs, and your entitlements in order to move in the benevolent direction, because the intensification of all power in the universe is flowing in that direction. What's that going to do? That's going to attract everything that exists for the purpose of that charge in the first place to you. And the more that you move in the opposite direction, not only are you moving away in terms of charge, so you're becoming more malevolent, but you are also drawing away from Elohim, which means you're becoming less and less powerful. And now we get to the idea of frequency, because why? The sentiment of frequency is that the higher that something vibrates at frequency, it is less solid. Remember, Yeshua said, ye will worship in spirit and truth. Remember, Yeshua said, because God is spirit, right? Theos is pneuma, or Elohim is ruach. Meaning what? That there is a positive or benevolent charge moving in a certain direction, vectored towards what? Those who are called, who love God and are called according to his purpose. All things work out for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Now, the premise is that the sons of God then are what? Being longed for with birth pains. Same word used in Genesis 3:16, when Yahweh doesn't curse Eve, but says, I'm going to fulfill that void in you that you have been trying to fulfill by eating that fruit. I'm going to give you children, but there's going to be a birth pain. There's going to be a labor of intensity to what? To show you what's actually going on with creation, that creation is waiting, longing for us to move towards that charge in the right direction in order to draw near. So at the top of the list, at the existence of just that singularity, that oneness, is an intention of benevolence. As we move into the contractions of darkness, we will find that there is a greater necessity for instruction that actually spreads out. So there's a point in time where we go from just love, which is absolute benevolence without any limitation, to love the Lord your God. What is that? Yahweh Elohim. What is Yahweh Elohim? He's the clan leader. You're all Elohim, but he's the absolute Elohim, Yahweh Elohim. And what? As we're moving in that direction, as that process is occurring, then we are what? Putting that benevolence, we are coming into agreement with him in that charge. We're coming alongside with him in that charge. That's love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. So how would that work with a human being? Well, that's the final part of this message. So in order to understand that, what we need to do is we need to understand the same magnetic forces when it comes to a human being. Now, if you question whether this is true or not, all you need to do is go get hooked up to a heart machine or hooked up to an EKG. You need to understand that within the human being, there is actually what? There is a magnetic field around us. And that magnetic field around us is going to be moving in a certain direction in respect to everyone else. Why? Because there is an actual current inside of us that is producing a wave-like pattern that is traceable on multiple electronic detectors, whether it be your brain waves, your heart waves, your blood pressure, etc. Now, the premise is that blood goes back and forth and therefore has what? It has a currency that's moving in opposite directions back and forth. What's that creating? That's creating that electric movement. That's creating the actual magnetic field that we can trace in an echocardiogram. Now, all that's the result of frequency and oscillation, but the premise is that if we had someone else present, okay, we have someone else present, and they are in the process of experiencing a benevolent energy, okay, when we encounter those electromagnetic fields around that person that contain the information about their emotion, then what? We have that tendency to experience attraction. Remember what I told you, I think it was in the imagination series, but it might have been in the discussion about Elohim, that there was this premise of connection, emotional connection, and how we affect each other. So now the premise is that now what we have is we have a transference, right, or a movement of energy that for right now I'm going to illustrate as contemporary, okay? Contemporary. There's a drawing together and there's a contemporary movement of energy. However, that is very rarely the case. And the reason that is very rarely the case is because of the concept of the greater and lesser. Let me explain. When we talk about entrainment, what we are talking about is the idea that something is operating at a higher frequency than another thing, okay? So you take a bunch of clocks and you set them in a room and you wind them up and you set them in a room and you turn them on at different intervals. Eventually, they will actually begin to tick with each other because of entrainment. Now, there is a belief that you can actually entrain the brain, entrain the heart, entrain the soul with different frequencies to get the actual mind to vibrate at a higher frequency. I don't deny that, and I can tell you that's a deep exploration into sound healing and the effect of sound upon our lives, including the sounds we can't hear, like the very, very low frequencies present in, say, 5G, or the very, very high frequencies present in those radio waves. And maybe I got those two mixed up. But the point is that as we experience frequencies we can't hear, they affect us still. They affect our electromagnetic field, and then they affect our soul, they affect our processes of existence. So in principle, then, as we look at this idea of these two, we need to think about the idea that one is giving and one is receiving, and that's kind of how it works. Now, there are those who are contemporary who are appointed to what? To accept your energy and give it back to you. Okay? Those are contemporaries. Then we have subordinates where we offer energy and they don't give it back to us, right? Because they need to be elevated. All right. And so that premise or that idea of elevation comes from the idea of us pouring energy in, which of course empties us out. And we need to be careful about that. Then the final one, of course, is the subordinate, where we are actually receiving energy from a higher, right? A greater. And as we receive that energy, we can't reciprocate it because we can't elevate to that level that they're at yet. Okay. Because we can only handle so much because we haven't had an expansion occur yet. Remember, the expansion is what causes the elevation in the first place. And once you exceed your potential or capacity, you will be moved into a new season, and that new season that you moved into will not be like the one that you left. It will be a very different season, and when that occurs, it's because you've exceeded your potential, and now there is a greater purpose or intention that needs to occur. You expand. Of course, there's a void that occurs, and that void, of course, then what needs to be filled, which you have to not steal energy from other people, but instead you allow energy to come in from a greater who is still elevated above you, but now you have elevated. Because the moment that you come into a state where you have a full capacity, you're going to expand. That expansion is movement that's exceeding your potential. That's obviously simple as a promotion at a job, et cetera, but that's also growing, right? That's maturing. Okay, so here's the final element of this. And that is that if energy cannot be created nor destroyed, that means that there is only so much energy actually present. Okay. And if there's only so much energy actually present, then there's a premise that it has to be taken from somewhere else. And when it's taken from somewhere else, a void occurs. You need to be aware of that when you're dealing with this, because now you understand that this right here is your emotional projection upon another person. You become angry and begin to project your energy, and now that person becomes angry. They will walk away with that malevolent energy processing within them. You will walk away with that malevolent energy processing within you, which many who I have talked to, counseled, mentored, or coached, I can tell you that they will tell me that they feel dirty or unclean, which of course we can get into the mikvah and the changing of status and the energy that's present in water that seems to somehow alter your unclean state. But in its simplicity, we can agree and accept that when you walk away from a malevolent force, you yourself experience malevolence. Now, that can come in the form of wounds that are triggered, right? That can come in the form of limiting beliefs that are triggered, or that can come in the form of entitlements that are triggered as a result of what? As a result of you not actually operating within your purpose. That's a whole nother element. That's the Renewing Your Mind series where we can get into those things. But the short version of this is what you need to understand is that like kind attracts like kind because it's moving in the same flow and direction as the benevolence of the intensification of all power in the universe. What is the actual positive charge? Well, let's take a simple one. Thou shalt not kill. What's that premise there? What's the idea there? That you will not extinguish a life without a reason to be doing it. Thou shalt not kill or thou shalt not murder is very different from an execution as a result of a capital offense, which we can get into at another time, perhaps in the Midrash discussion, who knows. But what you understand is thou shalt not kill is telling you don't kill your fellow man. Don't hurt them for no reason. Because why? You need to view them as what? A fractal emanation of the intensification of all power in the universe dialed back through a what? A transformer, as it were. A actual bringing a voltage down to a smaller voltage. Lightning traveling to a ground reduced by a resistor. That's the simplicity of this, guys. And so now you can understand that there's an element here where you now need to realize how much you actually affect the rest of the universe, because every energy used is borrowed from somewhere else. which means there's a cost for you to move your energy into someone else. But there's also a cost when somebody moves their energy into you, and you need to be aware of that, especially when it comes to your spouses or to your children or to your contemporaries, your friends, or your students. And then you also need to have the empathy that once a person has dumped their energy, you probably need to let them be, because they might be in a state of panic, wanting to steal energy or wanting to receive energy. They can't get it from you because you just got healed or you just got blessed, right? It's kind of that premise, like almost as if once you give that money for a tithe to a poor person, you going back and asking for it back. You can't do that, right? You would never do that. You wouldn't go to a guy who's got the cardboard sign and say, hey, I need that $10 back because I'm having a rough day. And so that's the premise where we really, really, really need to get our minds wrapped around the level at which we actually affect each other, because the truth is that this is about entrainment. That we literally will walk in, and whatever is the high, whatever is the most intensified frequency is going to cause all the other frequencies to move into that process. And if it's malevolent, then it's going to be moving in the opposite direction, but it's still going to attract. See, that's the part that I think you may have missed in this, is that if you have a negative going to a positive in both directions, they attract. But if you have a positive going to a negative in both directions, they attract. Meaning what? Like kind will attract like kind. Malevolent energies will attract more malevolent energies. Benevolent energies will attract more benevolent energies. And whatever is the most intense frequency in that space will entrain the other frequency. So now your temper actually creates an entire city of rage. That's right. That's the level of danger here, depending on how much you have actually resonated at. And we don't realize how much we actually affect everything around us. Why? Because the universe itself is actually what? Obeying our intention and our observation. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is a visualization that occurs, and this will go more into the imagination series, but there's a visualization that occurs when we have intention. And the universe will be obedient to that and has been obedient to that. Now, don't get me wrong, waves that contradict each other will reconcile. And we can cover that at another time, but the point behind it is they don't just kind of contradict each other and cancel each other out, as much as there's a reconciliation, and whatever is more prevalent is what will proceed. It's almost that premise of feeding which wolf, right? So why is all this so important? Because in the process of drawing near to Elohim, Adam is becoming more and more one, so that Adam and Elohim are becoming a totally different entity, as it were, as they attract closer to each other. Remember that Adam is actually the part of Adam that said, I don't necessarily want a part of Elohim. And the Elohim is what? I will not strive with man forever, for his days are 120 years, right? And so the premise is that Yahweh Elohim and Adam kind of moved away from each other in that process until flood. And then after that, during the Babylonian existence with Abraham, etc., there was a drawing near back. When I talk about drawing near to God, you need to understand that there is a premise here where that is going to require humility, which is a lowering of self, which is what? An opening up or allowing to be filled, right? So part of this also moves in the direction not only of instruction, which is Torah, which is the instruction to be benevolent to your fellow human, or to be benevolent to your Elohim, or to your Yahweh Elohim, I should say. In other words, to the Lord God. But also there is a premise that there is an energy that is the result of that humility and obedience, and that energy becomes something more. Now, when we look at that process of an electromagnetic field, which we'll call, for lack of better words, a biofield or an aura, you need to understand that the aura of the earth, and again, I apologize to my flat earthers. I can tell you this may be an offense to you, but the premise is that when we look at the aura of the earth, we know that what we are being protected from are cosmic rays or cosmic flares from the sun that are protecting us from these intense energies, right? Now we could understand how our magnetic energy around us could potentially affect the natural order processes of the universe. There's an element of that if we understood that better, we could actually repel certain things like surface tension, walking on water, repel certain things like the expiration of life, resurrection, repel certain things such as dis-ease, where a body comes back into natural order process as a result of our presence. This is Peter walking down the path and his shadow falling upon a person and them resurrecting from the dead. So now you understand that there's something outside of you that is affecting everything else around you. Animals, plants, minerals, etc., are all affected by that original oscillating frequency that you are operating in, where malevolent energies vibrate at a lower frequency and benevolent energies vibrate at a higher frequency, and that there is a potential for healing and for spiritual experience and everything else as a result of those energies. So now you could understand how coming into one accord doesn't necessarily have to do with an agreement of doctrine. Look at James, John, Peter, Paul. Do they agree doctrinally? Not really, right? There is a little bit of a deviation or difference. Paul has to resist Peter at what? At Antioch, right? James says, Paul, man, it looks like you're teaching that the law's been done away with, right? Why don't you go in the temple and fix that? James says, wash your hands, you sinners. Go back to the mikvah. Go and get baptized every single time you become unclean, right? Etc., etc., etc. What's my point? They did not have to necessarily agree on the interpretation of Torah. They had to agree to be obedient to it. But the actual accordness is this intensifying of emotional energy as an agreed frequency, right? That they came into an alignment through an entrainment, as it were, just like the clocks, right? So they start all vibrating at the same frequency, and all of a sudden Pentecost happens. Now, it was promised by Yeshua that that would happen, but he gave them instruction on how to do it, right? None of you leave Jerusalem. You all stay together, right? And furthermore, he gives instruction during the discussion after dinner, after the Last Supper. And so what are we learning and understanding from that? The kingdom of heaven is within us. It has something to do with vibration, frequency, and energy, and it has to do with how we affect the rest of the universe with that. Almost the butterfly effect, that that energy is borrowed from somewhere else, and therefore there's a cost. And therefore we need to understand that we need to be very careful on how we spend or how we expel our energy, who we give it to, etc., etc. Don't lay your hands on everybody, right? But also the flow. Remember the stupid water truck? This water truck just right in the middle of the road. I can't do anything. I'm thinking I'm going to wait here. I'm going to text them and say I'm a little bit late. No, I'm going to turn around and go the other way. Oh, wait, I'm not going to go down the hill. I'm going to go up the hill and over the hill and to another road. Maybe it's the scenic route. Maybe I just need to relax a little bit. Maybe I'm a little nervous about this message. And boom, here's this dude rolling a tire down the road. would have never encountered him, and everybody was passing him. And my mindset was the same as everybody else's. Oh, somebody will pick him up. Oh, he'll be fine. No, he was so grateful that he had gotten a ride. He was like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. And then when I got down and he said, all right, well, thank you, I appreciate it. I said, I'm not going anywhere. He's like, well, I'm not going to argue with you. I'll go right back up there with you. Yeah. And sure enough, that would have been a heck of a roll up that hill. What is that? That's the flow of benevolence that I followed, that I aligned with, and I drew near to God. I won't get into tithing, and I won't get into the kosher laws, and I won't get into the feast days when it comes to drawing near to God, but I can tell you that every one of them has something to do with what I taught today. So for those of you who are actually on YouTube, I am going to say Shabbat Shalom. And I will go ahead and end this live stream. And in order to do that, though, because my tablet is broken, I'm going to have to turn around and flip off the screen and all this other stuff. So for those of you on YouTube, Shabbat Shalom.